Welcome to Sleepy Time History, where we drift gently through the pages of the past. Tonight, we journey to a land of poetry, passion, and quiet power, a place where old stone villages sleep beneath lavender skies, where artists once painted by the River Seine, and where revolutions were whispered before they roared. This is the story of France, a country shaped by empires and artists, by monarchs and rebels, by thinkers, farmers, and dreamers alike. From its ancient beginnings deep beneath prehistoric caves, to its royal courts and battlefields, to its cafes and cathedrals, France has always moved to the rhythm of change. So, tuck yourself in, close your eyes, and let us carry you through 1,000 years of French history, softly, slowly, one gentle moment at a time. This is Sleepy Time History, and this is the story of France. Long before the world knew the name France, long before castles crowned green hills or poets penned verses in candlelight, the land that would become France was alive with footsteps. Ancient footsteps. Quiet ones, soft ones, pressed gently into the fertile soil by early humans tens of thousands of years ago. Let us drift back, far back, to a time when the world was colder, and the great sheets of ice crept down from the north. In the sheltering valleys of southern France, the flicker of firelight once danced on the walls of deep limestone caves. These were the homes, the sanctuaries, and the spiritual chambers of our distant ancestors. Inside these caves, especially the famous ones at Lascaux and Chauvet, incredible stories were told, not with words, but with color and motion. Animals leapt across stone walls, great bulls, galloping horses, silent stags with proud antlers, all painted with breathtaking care by Paleolithic artists some 30,000 years ago. The details are astonishing, even today. You can almost hear the hoofbeats and feel the reverence. These cave paintings weren't mere decorations. They were offerings to the unseen, perhaps rituals of survival, of thanks, or awe. Life in this ancient France, though it wasn't called that, was guided by the rhythms of nature. Communities hunted reindeer and mammoths. They shaped tools from flint, carved figures from ivory, and wrapped themselves in furs to weather the cold. The landscape was untamed, yet full of promise. Rivers like the Seine and the Rhone wound through valleys and forests, their banks teeming with life. As time passed, the ice retreated and forests spread. A new chapter began, the Neolithic Age. Around 6000 BCE, farming communities emerged in the south. People began planting grains, domesticating animals, and settling into small villages. Stone houses replaced animal skin tents. Pottery began to appear. And along the Atlantic coasts, people started raising mysterious stone monuments that still puzzle us today. One of the most impressive of these is found in Carnac, in the region of Brittany. There, thousands of megalithic stones, tall, weathered, and silent, stand in lines stretching for kilometers. No one knows for certain why they were placed. Were they a celestial calendar, a ritual path, a monument to the ancestors? Their presence reminds us that even then, humans in this land looked to the heavens, sought meaning in stone and sky, and marked their place in the world with care. These early peoples were not alone. Over time, waves of migration brought new faces, new customs. The Bell Beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery, spread across Western Europe. Then came the Celts, whose presence would shape the land more dramatically. By around 1000 BCE, Celtic tribes had spread throughout what is now France. They called their land Gaul, and themselves the Gauls. They lived in fortified hilltop settlements known as oppida, grew grain in the valleys, and honored gods of thunder and forests, rivers and war. Skilled metalworkers, they forged beautiful jewelry and powerful weapons from iron and gold. They traded across the continent and even with the Mediterranean world, exchanging amber and salt for wine and ceramics. The Gauls spoke a melodic Celtic language, passed down through oral tradition. Their wise men, the Druids, were guardians of sacred knowledge. Though they left no written texts, Roman authors would later describe them as priests, judges, teachers, and astronomers. They kept the stories of their people alive through memory and voice, under star-filled skies beside roaring hearths. Nature was sacred to them. Great groves of oak were temples. Springs were watched over by spirits. And the cycle of seasons shaped every rhythm of life, from sowing and harvest to battle and rest. As we drift gently into slumber, let's imagine this early France, a land of dense forests and wide rivers, of misty hills echoing with birdsong, of peaceful villages and vibrant rituals. A land already deeply human, already sacred. The Gauls, with their war cries and songs, their horned helmets and silver torques, were not primitive, but richly cultured and fiercely proud. This was the cradle of the French spirit, long before the flag and the fleur-de-lis, before Versailles and revolutions. Here, in the land of Gaul, the soul of France was born. Let's rest now, and in our next segment, we'll journey deeper into the world of the Gauls and the ancient civilizations that would soon clash with them. Long before the echoes of royal courts or the roar of revolutionary crowds, the land now known as France was home to a quiet, enduring rhythm, the heartbeat of ancient civilizations whose footprints are gently buried beneath layers of soil and time. As the Ice Age gradually receded and the climate warmed, early humans began to roam the region some 1.8 million years ago. These prehistoric peoples were among the first to craft stone tools and navigate the challenges of a changing world. But it was in the Paleolithic era, roughly 30,000 years ago, that France became home to something remarkable, the flowering of early human creativity. In the cool, dim recesses of caves like Lascaux and Chauvet, early artists painted scenes of galloping horses, antelope, and massive bison. Using natural pigments and flickering torchlight, they told stories on stone walls, leaving behind whispers of their lives and beliefs in a time before written words. These early communities, composed of small bands of hunter-gatherers, moved in harmony with the seasons. They tracked herds, gathered roots and berries, and shared warmth around communal fires. The rhythm of nature dictated their days. Over time, as the Mesolithic period gave way to the Neolithic, these bands began to settle. They tamed the wild, tilled the earth, and raised animals. The dawn of farming brought new possibilities, more stable food sources, growing villages, and the slow, deliberate shaping of society. By around 6000 BCE, Neolithic communities had taken root across what is now southern and central France. They built stone houses, crafted pottery, and carved idols from wood and bone. Some left behind great stone monuments, mysterious megaliths like those found at Carnac in Brittany. Hundreds of towering stones stretch across the fields in ordered rows, their purpose still debated today. Were they ritual spaces? Celestial calendars? Markers of the ancestors? The truth is buried in mystery, but their silent presence speaks to a people who held deep reverence for the land and the sky above. As centuries passed, these early communities evolved into more complex cultures. During the Bronze Age, around 2000 BCE, new tools and weapons began to appear. Traders brought tin and copper, weaving together a web of commerce that reached from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. Small hilltop fortresses began to dot the landscape, the forerunners of later castles, as communities organized for both defense and prosperity. They spun wool, brewed beer, and carved their beliefs into small votive offerings buried in sacred places. Then came the Iron Age, and with it, a new people who would leave a lasting imprint on the soul of France: the Celts. By the 5th century BCE, Celtic tribes, known as the Gauls, had spread across much of the region. Their world was rich and vibrant, filled with music, oral storytelling, intricate art, and a deep connection to nature. The Gauls lived in fortified settlements called oppida, strategically placed on hilltops and riverbanks. They worshipped in sacred groves, honored deities of the forest, sky, and underworld, and consulted druids, wise spiritual leaders who kept the oral traditions of their people alive. The Gauls were not a single unified group, but rather a tapestry of tribes, each with its own customs and rulers. Yet they shared a common language, artistic style, and warrior spirit. They were skilled metalworkers, crafting delicate torques, elegant necklaces of twisted gold and bronze, and finely detailed weapons. Their shields bore swirling patterns, and their homes were warm with woven blankets and carved wooden furniture. Their lives revolved around seasons and festivals, with great feasts held in honor of the gods and ancestors. The sound of lyres and flutes would drift through the air, mingling with the smell of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread. Children played beneath oak trees, elders told tales by firelight, and traders journeyed along well-worn paths, bringing news from distant lands. But this golden age of Gallic culture was not without struggle. Fierce intertribal rivalries sometimes led to war. And on the distant horizon, across the Alps, a great empire was rising, one that would eventually turn its gaze toward Gaul. Around 121 BCE, Roman legions made their first serious incursions into southern Gaul. At first, these campaigns were limited, focused on securing trade routes and alliances. But by 58 BCE, under the command of Julius Caesar, Rome launched a full-scale conquest of Gaul. It would become one of the most dramatic and decisive chapters in French history. The Gallic Wars raged for nearly a decade. Tribe after tribe fell before the might of Rome, despite fierce resistance. The most famous of these resistors was Vercingetorix, the noble chieftain of the Arverni. In 52 BCE, he united many Gallic tribes in a last stand against Caesar. His leadership was bold and strategic, but ultimately he was defeated at the siege of Alesia. Captured and paraded through Rome, he would spend his final years in a prison cell before being executed. With his fall, Gaul was fully absorbed into the Roman Empire. The old Celtic ways were gradually folded into Roman life. Latin replaced the Gaulish tongue, Roman temples rose where sacred groves once stood, and Roman roads cut straight through the countryside. Yet the spirit of the Gauls did not vanish. It lingered in local customs, in place names, and in the stubborn independence of the people. As Gaul became a Roman province, it also became a center of civilization. Cities like Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, Nemours, Nîmes, and Lutetia, Paris, flourished with baths, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and bustling marketplaces. Roman law and order brought stability, trade flourished, and cultures mixed. Gallic artisans adapted Roman styles, blending them with their own traditions to create a uniquely Gallo-Roman culture. Christianity began to spread quietly through Gaul in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, carried by missionaries and whispered through underground gatherings. Over time, churches replaced temples, and the old gods were remembered more in folklore than in faith. And as the Roman Empire began to wane, cracks began to appear. The once mighty legions thinned, and tribal groups from beyond the Rhine began to press inward. Among them were the Franks, a Germanic people whose name would one day give France its name. Drift with me now, into the misty shadows of a time when the land we now call France echoed with the thunder of boots and the clash of iron. For thousands of years, France was a land many longed to conquer, and many tried. Let us return to the age when the ancient Celts, known as the Gauls, lived in wide forest clearings and hilltop fortresses, or oppida. They were fiercely independent tribes, draped in woven cloaks and skilled in metalwork. Though they shared customs and language, the Gauls were not one kingdom, but dozens of separate tribes. And it was this disunity that would make them vulnerable when the world's most powerful empire came knocking. In 121 BCE, Rome began to take an interest in this fertile land. It wasn't long before Roman ambitions stretched beyond the Alps. Enter Julius Caesar, ambitious, cunning, and determined. In 58 BCE, he launched the Gallic Wars, a brutal series of campaigns that lasted nearly a decade. Tribe after tribe fell to the disciplined Roman legions. Among the Gauls, one name would rise as a symbol of resistance: Vercingetorix, chieftain of the Arverni. With wild red hair and a golden torque around his neck, he united rival tribes to make a final stand against Rome. In 52 BCE, at the Battle of Gergovia, he won a rare victory against Caesar. But later that year, he was besieged at Alesia, where, starved and surrounded, he surrendered. His defiance was remembered, even as he was taken to Rome in chains. Gaul, as France was called then, became fully absorbed into the Roman Empire. For over 400 years, the land thrived under Roman rule. Roads were built, cities flourished, and Roman culture intertwined with local traditions. Cities like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Nemours, Nîmes, and Massilia, Marseille, became bustling centers of trade and art. Roman baths, amphitheaters, and aqueducts reshaped the landscape, and Latin began to seep into the local tongue. But empires rise, and empires fall. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire began to falter. Waves of invaders crossed into Gaul: Franks, Visigoths, Alemanni, and Burgundians. These were the so-called barbarian tribes, fierce, mobile, and eager to carve out their own kingdoms. Roman legions thinned, cities weakened, and the once mighty empire could no longer defend its borders. One group would leave a lasting legacy: the Franks. Originating in the Rhine Valley, they slowly pushed deeper into Gaul. Around 481 CE, a young Frankish leader named Clovis I rose to power. He united the Frankish tribes and launched campaigns to conquer what remained of Roman Gaul. In a legendary battle near Soissons, Clovis vanquished the last Roman forces, and became the first king of the Franks to rule much of what would become France. But his legacy was not built on war alone. In 496, Clovis famously converted to Christianity, influenced by his wife, Queen Clotilde. This act endeared him to the Roman Catholic Church and ensured that Christianity, rather than older pagan beliefs or Eastern sects, would take root across the land. His baptism in Reims became a symbol of sacred kingship, a tradition that would endure for centuries. Under Clovis and his Merovingian descendants, a new French identity began to form. Not Roman, not Gallic, but something unique. Still, these early medieval times were far from peaceful. Power shifted from kings to mayors of the palace, and eventually, to the powerful Carolingian dynasty. One of its most famous sons would rise to dominate Western Europe: Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Crowned Emperor of the Romans in the year 800 by Pope Leo III, Charlemagne ruled not just France, but a vast realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He built schools, codified laws, and encouraged learning, ushering in what some call the Carolingian Renaissance. His palace at Aachen shimmered with scholarship and devotion. But it was also a time of frequent campaigns against Saxons, Lombards, and Moors. Yet even his mighty empire could not last forever. After Charlemagne's death, his realm was divided among his sons, leading to the fragmentation of power. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun split his empire into three parts, laying the groundwork for modern France and Germany. And so, from Celtic hill forts to Roman cities, from Frankish swords to imperial thrones, France was shaped by centuries of conquest and invasion. Each wave left its mark, not to erase what came before, but to layer new stories on ancient soil. As the stars shimmer gently above the quiet hills and sleepy rivers of France, these echoes of history still whisper through the ruins, the cathedrals, and the winding village roads. The land remembers, and so do we. Let the soft night carry you forward now, to a time when the soil of France, already steeped in centuries of legend and strife, began to pulse with ambition, power, and cultural rebirth. It is the age of kings and cathedrals, of courts and colonies, a time when France would rise not just as a kingdom, but as an empire. As the Middle Ages unfolded, the Kingdom of France slowly evolved from the scattered territories of feudal lords to a more centralized realm. The Capetian dynasty, beginning with Hugh Capet in 987, laid the groundwork for a line of kings that would rule France for over 800 years. His realm was small at first, just a cluster around Paris. But generation after generation, the Capetians expanded their power through diplomacy, marriage, and war. The early centuries were marked by struggles between the monarchy and powerful nobles, especially the Plantagenet dynasty of England, who held vast lands in what is now western France. This rivalry would eventually erupt into one of the most defining conflicts in French history: the 100 Years' War. From 1337 to 1453, France and England clashed over claims to the French throne. Castles were besieged, fields turned to mud, and entire villages were left in silence. Yet from the chaos rose one of France's most enduring figures, Joan of Arc. In 1429, a young peasant girl from Domremy, guided by visions of saints, led the French army to victory at Orleans. Her courage rekindled national spirit. Captured by the English and burned as a heretic in 1431, Joan became a martyr, later canonized as a saint. Her legacy helped unify a fractured France and breathe life into a kingdom on the edge. By the time the 100 Years' War ended, the French monarchy stood stronger than ever. Kings like Louis XI, the universal spider, wove alliances and subdued unruly lords, centralizing authority. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, a flowering of art, science, and architecture. French kings, especially Francis I, patronized artists, thinkers, and builders. Inspired by Italy, Francis brought Leonardo da Vinci to France, where he would spend his final years. Elegant chateaux began dotting the Loire Valley, dreamlike palaces surrounded by gardens, moats, and forests. These were the jewels of a rising nation. But expansion did not stop at home. As seafaring powers like Spain and Portugal reached across oceans, France too turned its gaze outward. In the 16th and 17th centuries, French explorers charted the coasts of North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River, laying claim to what would become New France in Canada. Colonies blossomed in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Senegal, Madagascar, and Indochina. The French colonial empire grew, and with it came wealth and tragedy. Sugar, spices, and furs flowed into French ports. But this prosperity was built on the backs of the enslaved. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, and made to labor in French colonies. Their stories, too, are part of France's legacy, painful, enduring, and never forgotten. At home, absolute monarchy reached its zenith under the Sun King himself, Louis XIV. Ascending to the throne in 1643, Louis ruled for 72 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. His court at Versailles, a golden palace with mirrored halls and sprawling gardens, became the center of European culture. Artists, poets, musicians, and courtiers orbited the king like planets around a sun. Louis XIV expanded French borders through wars and diplomacy, making France the dominant power in Europe. Yet his ambitions strained the treasury and sowed seeds of discontent. Heavy taxes, religious persecution, especially of the Huguenots, French Protestants, and rigid social hierarchies left many in quiet despair. Still, this was an era of elegance. French became the language of diplomacy. Philosophy flourished under minds like Descartes, Pascal, and Voltaire. The Age of Enlightenment had begun, and with it, questions about kings and rights, power and people. As we drift further along the river of time, we approach the moment when empire turns inward, when the power once celebrated becomes the object of revolution. But for now, in this moment, France glows with grandeur. In the gardens of Versailles, fountains still whisper. In port cities like Bordeaux and Marseille, ships creak gently in the moonlight, their sails folding like tired wings. And in every village square, beneath candle-lit taverns and starlit abbeys, people speak of kings and distant lands, of art and God, of reason and hope. The empire has grown, and its soul, though conflicted, is awake. As we gently drift deeper into France's past, let us turn now to the stories of resistance and rebellion, chapters marked not only by conflict, but by courage, voices rising from the quiet corners of society, and the enduring spirit of liberty. These are moments when the people of France, in towns and in fields, in salons and in streets, stood up and said, "No," sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with arms. France's long history of rebellion begins not in chaos, but in a quiet discontent, an unease that often brewed beneath elegant facades and royal decrees. One of the most profound expressions of rebellion came in the late 18th century, when the pressure of centuries reached its breaking point. This was the dawn of the French Revolution, a sweeping tide that would reshape not just France, but much of the world. In 1789, under a heavy sky of economic turmoil, hunger, and inequality, the people began to rise. The Estates General, called for the first time in 175 years, turned into a spark when the Third Estate, made up of common citizens, broke away and declared itself the National Assembly. The storming of the Bastille on July 14th was more than the fall of a prison, it was the collapse of centuries of royal power. Across France, peasants burned feudal records, stormed manors, and demanded justice. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted shortly thereafter, echoed with the hope that liberty, equality, and fraternity might finally find real soil in France. But revolutions are rarely simple. What followed was not immediate peace, but rather the reign of terror, as France grappled with its identity. Robespierre, once seen as a defender of the people, became a symbol of fear as the guillotine cast its long shadow across Paris. Yet, even in this darkness, there was resistance, from moderates, from royalists, and from everyday citizens who longed for order amid the storm. As the revolution gave way to Napoleon's empire, rebellion took on a different form. French citizens, weary of war and conscription, began to resist in small ways. In the countryside, rumors of revolt stirred among those who wanted their sons returned. And when Napoleon fell, the monarchy returned, but so too did the spirit of opposition. The 19th century in France was a whirlwind of shifting powers, each met with its own wave of rebellion. In 1830, the July Revolution forced the abdication of King Charles X, whose attempts to reinstate absolute monarchy were met with barricades in the streets. Once again, Parisians rose up, toppling a king in just 3 days. The tricolor flag flew once more. Just 18 years later, the streets of Paris echoed with gunfire again. The Revolution of 1848 saw the end of King Louis Philippe's rule and the brief birth of the Second Republic. In this moment, we see not only rebellion against a king, but a cry for justice, an early movement toward workers' rights, dignity, and the right to be heard. But perhaps one of the most haunting and poetic chapters of French rebellion came during the Paris Commune of 1871. After defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the capture of Napoleon III, Parisians declared their own radical government. For 2 months, red flags flew over the city as workers tried to build a new world, one without privilege or oppression. Their vision was crushed in La Semaine Sanglante, or the Bloody Week, when government forces stormed Paris and ended the Commune with devastating violence. But the idea lingered, like embers that never quite went out. Moving into the 20th century, resistance took on new meaning. As the world plunged into war, France again became a land of conflict. During World War II, after the German occupation of France in 1940, the French resistance emerged, quiet at first, then stronger, then indispensable. These were not armies in the traditional sense. They were teachers and farmers, artists and students, men and women of all walks of life. They passed messages, sabotaged rail lines, and printed underground newspapers. Charles de Gaulle, speaking from London, became the voice of Free France. Resistance leaders like Jean Moulin gave their lives to unite the underground movements. In the dark years of occupation, it was often the smallest acts, a leaflet, a hidden radio, a forged document, that carried the greatest weight. The French resistance was not perfect. It was fractured, complex, and at times uncertain. But it was deeply human. It spoke to the soul of a nation that refused to surrender entirely, even when its government had signed the armistice. When liberation finally came in 1944, it was not just soldiers who celebrated. It was the resistance fighters who had waited in shadow, the quiet rebels who had risked everything. France had been tested, and through rebellion, it had endured. But rebellion in France was never solely political. There was also cultural rebellion, found in the cafés of Paris where writers challenged convention, in the songs of Edith Piaf, and the existential musings of Sartre and Camus. Even in art, resistance lived, in brushstrokes, in poems, in the refusal to be defined by the past. In the late 1960s, another kind of rebellion stirred. In May 1968, students in Paris occupied universities, demanding changes in education, work, and society. Their protest grew into a general strike that brought much of France to a halt. What began with graffiti and leaflets became one of the most significant uprisings in post-war Europe. Though the movement fractured, it left a mark, pushing France further towards social liberalization. Throughout it all, from medieval towns to modern cities, resistance has been part of the French heartbeat. It is the voice in the square, the woman handing out banned pamphlets, the artist painting in defiance, the young student shouting slogans on the left bank. It is the quiet bravery of saying non when silence is expected. And so, in this chapter of France's story, we do not only see revolution, we see resolve. We see that liberty is not always born from peace, and that change often comes with great sacrifice. Let the story of France's resistance and rebellion lull you to reflection, like the fading echo of footsteps down a cobbled Paris street. In the hush of twilight, their voices still whisper in the wind. That freedom is not a gift, but a flame, kept alive by those who dare to resist. As our journey through the tapestry of France's past continues, we now reach those moments where the course of history shifted, sometimes gently, like a tide pulling at the shore, and other times with thunder, like a storm breaking over the land. These are the turning points, the bends in the river of time that led France toward the nation it is today. Let us return for a moment to the quiet countryside of Gaul, centuries ago, when Julius Caesar's conquest of the region forever altered its destiny. Though ancient, this moment was a pivot from tribal independence to Roman governance, from oral histories to written laws, and from scattered communities to the formation of cities like Lugdunum, today known as Lyon. Much later, another shift came with the rise of the Carolingian Empire, particularly under the rule of Charlemagne. Crowned Emperor of the Romans in the year 800, he represented not just military strength, but the union of French, Germanic, and Christian traditions. His rule laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the notion of France as both a kingdom and a cultural beacon of Europe. But it is in the year 1066, though a date more often associated with England, that we find another turning point. William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and claimed the English crown. This victory bound the fates of England and France for centuries, igniting rivalry, war, and diplomacy that would shape both realms. For France, it meant constant tugging between noble houses and a long-standing dance with its island neighbor. A darker turning point arrived with the arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century. The plague swept across Europe, reaching France and leaving nearly half the population gone. Beyond the sorrow, this devastation shifted power structures. With so many lives lost, labor became precious. Peasants found new leverage. Feudal lords, once mighty, saw their grip begin to slip. It was, in a grim way, the beginning of modern social change. And then, in the 15th century, came a young girl with visions, Joan of Arc. In the midst of the 100 Years' War, she rallied French troops, claiming divine guidance. Her victories at Orleans and beyond helped turn the tide for France, lifting morale and leading to the coronation of Charles VII. Though burned at the stake, her courage echoed far beyond her time. Joan became a symbol, not just of faith or nationalism, but of the power one voice can have against the currents of history. Centuries later, the French Revolution, as we visited earlier, marked perhaps the most profound turning point. In 1789, the monarchy's authority crumbled. The revolution was not just a political event, it was a philosophical shift. For the first time, ideas like universal rights, popular sovereignty, and citizenship took root on a national scale. France became the laboratory of modern democracy. Though it stumbled through bloodshed and empire, the very soul of France changed. Following the revolution, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte reshaped not only France, but all of Europe. His military brilliance, though undeniable, led to wars that reached from Moscow to Madrid. But Napoleon also reformed French law through the Napoleonic Code, a legal foundation still echoed in today's systems around the world. His reign ended in exile, but France would never return to the Ancien regime. It had irrevocably moved forward. A quieter, yet vital, turning point came with the Industrial Revolution. Though Britain led the charge, France followed closely. Railroads crisscrossed the land. Cities grew taller. Workers flooded into urban centers. With progress came protest. The 19th century in France was filled with strikes, reforms, and the birth of socialist ideas. These struggles shaped modern labor laws and kindled a spirit of social justice that still burns brightly. And then came the wars, the First World War, where France became a trench-scarred battlefield, and the Second World War, where occupation tested the nation's very soul. The fall of France in 1940, followed by the rise of the Vichy regime, marked a moment of despair. But from that darkness rose the French resistance and the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, who helped restore dignity and independence. De Gaulle would return once more in 1958 during another turning point, the birth of the Fifth Republic. This new constitution gave France a strong executive branch, ensuring stability after years of political turbulence. Under de Gaulle's guidance, France reasserted its global position, withdrew from colonial entanglements, and modernized its institutions. Yet not all turning points are political. Some are cultural. In the 20th century, France emerged as a global center for art, literature, film, and philosophy. From the surrealist canvases of Salvador Dali in Paris to the existentialist debates of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, France redefined how the world saw the self, society, and reality. And then, in May 1968, another shift occurred, not through kings or presidents, but through students and workers. The protests that swept Paris called for freedom in education, equality in the workplace, and an end to authoritarianism. Though the movement fractured, it left deep marks on French society, pushing the country toward greater inclusion and modern liberal values. In recent decades, France has faced new crossroads, questions about identity, immigration, secularism, and globalization. The turn of the millennium brought with it hopes, but also challenges. From the financial crisis of 2008 to the tragic terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015, which shook the nation to its core. Each event marked a pause, a reckoning, a moment where the country asked itself, who are we, and where are we going? And yet, France continues. It reflects, reforms, resists, and reimagines. Its turning points are not confined to marble halls or battlefield maps. Sometimes they unfold quietly. A new law passed, a protester's chant, a child reading Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité etched above a schoolhouse door. Change is always happening, sometimes grand, sometimes subtle, but always shaping. So as you close your eyes tonight, drifting deeper into the story of France, think of time as a gentle river, bending, flowing, meandering. And in those bends, in those ripples, lie the turning points of a nation. The moments when everything changed, and the story continued. Throughout the centuries, while kings and emperors ruled from lofty palaces, and while philosophers debated in candlelit salons, the real heartbeat of France pulsed in its people. In village squares and city cafes, in vineyards and textile mills, the voices of the French people rose, sometimes softly, sometimes like thunder. Tonight, we quiet ourselves and listen to them. Long before the nation was called France, the Celtic tribes of Gaul spoke in 100 tongues, their lives shaped by forests, rivers, and stars. Though their stories are mostly lost to time, echoes remain in place names and ancient songs passed down from grandmother to grandchild. Their voices remind us that belonging to a land begins not with borders, but with a deep, living connection to earth and sky. As centuries turned and France became a kingdom, peasants sowed wheat, pressed grapes, and raised families in the shadow of stone chateaux. Their lives were shaped by the rhythm of the land, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, gathering by hearth in winter. While nobles danced in Versailles, these people carried France on their backs. They rarely appeared in history books, but they wrote their own chapters in every cobbled path, every candle lit, every lullaby sung to sleep. In medieval towns, artisans and guild workers raised cathedrals toward the heavens, each stone a quiet prayer. Their labor, humble yet divine, gave rise to Gothic masterpieces like Chartres and Notre Dame, places where even today the past seems to whisper through stained glass and ancient pews. Then came the revolution. It was the people, farmers, bakers, cobblers, and teachers, who took to the streets. It was their hunger for dignity, bread, and voice that toppled centuries of monarchy. From the markets of Marseille to the alleys of Paris, the cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité was more than a motto. It was a song, a scream, a dream. Later, during the turmoil of industrialization, the voices of factory workers and coal miners rose again. They demanded fair wages, safe conditions, and a future for their children. In Lille and Saint-Étienne, women worked endless shifts in textile mills, while men labored deep underground, rarely seeing daylight. Yet in their letters and poems, in union meetings and music halls, they carved out moments of joy and resistance. During the wars, it was not only soldiers who bore the weight of battle. Mothers raised sons alone. Farmers fed villages despite shortages. Resistance fighters, many of them teenagers, passed secret messages and sabotaged rail lines. In the stillness of occupied France, their courage bloomed in silence. Even under the darkest skies, the people's voices did not falter. They whispered of hope, of freedom, of a France yet to come. And in the decades after, those voices expanded. France became a mosaic of identities. From Algerian immigrants seeking work in the booming post-war economy, to Vietnamese, Senegalese, and Moroccan families who brought their food, music, and language, France began to reflect the full color of its colonial past and its global future. These communities enriched the fabric of the nation, even as they faced discrimination and struggle. Their voices rang out from Parisian banlieues and Marseille port neighborhoods, not always heard, but always vital. In the sounds of Rai music, in the scent of couscous in family kitchens, in the laughter of children switching between French and Arabic or Wolof, France evolved, not by decree, but by lived experience. And what of the artists? The dancers, the poets, the painters who spoke not with laws but with feeling? Think of Edith Piaf, whose voice, raw and trembling, held within it all the sorrow and hope of a wounded nation. Or Camille Claudel, whose sculptures seemed to breathe, despite a life of heartbreak. Or Victor Hugo, whose words gave the poor a voice, and whose Quasimodo reminded the world that love and dignity live even in the most forgotten souls. The people's voices have also taken the form of protest. In 1968, students and workers flooded the streets, dreaming of a freer, fairer world. Their graffiti became poetry, beneath the paving stones, the beach. Their footsteps echoed with the yearning of a new generation refusing to be silenced. And today, in cafes and classrooms, on radio shows and in digital spaces, the people of France still speak. They speak in poetry slams and protest marches, in philosophical debates and family dinners. They speak with conviction, with compassion, with an eternal desire to be seen and heard. Even the silence of remembrance is a voice. Each November, the nation pauses for those lost in wars. In quiet ceremonies across the countryside, candles are lit, names are read, and in that stillness, the people remember. For France has never been just its leaders or laws. It has been its weavers and winemakers, its street musicians and school teachers. It is the grandfather who remembers the war, and the granddaughter who imagines a better tomorrow. As you breathe gently now, sinking deeper into rest, imagine their voices like the wind in the poplar trees, each whisper a piece of the French soul. They speak not just of pain, but of perseverance. Not just of past, but of presence. And in their many languages, from Breton to Berber, they remind us. France lives through its people. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, France, like so many nations, stood at a crossroads. No longer the colonial empire it once was, no longer ruled by kings or shaken by revolutions, it had entered a new kind of struggle, quieter, but no less profound. This is the story of a country learning to balance its proud traditions with an ever-changing present. It is the story of debates in cafes, marches through cobbled streets, and the questions asked late at night in quiet homes. Modern France is, at first glance, a picture of serenity. Lavender fields stretch under Provençal skies. Parisians sip espresso at sidewalk tables. Artists paint by the banks of the Seine, and lovers stroll through Montmartre. Yet beneath this charm lies a complex story. After World War II, France experienced a period of rapid growth known as Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 Glorious Years. From 1945 to 1975, factories boomed, cities grew, and the French middle class expanded. But this prosperity, like all things, was not equally shared. Migrant workers, many from former colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia, arrived to help rebuild the nation. They worked long hours in mines and construction sites, often living in cramped and forgotten housing estates on the edges of cities. Their contributions were immense, but their voices were seldom heard. By the 1980s and 90s, France found itself struggling with issues of integration and identity. In suburbs like Saint-Denis outside Paris, new generations were born, French by birth, but not always treated as such. They spoke French, dreamed in French, voted in French elections. Yet still, they faced barriers. In jobs, in schools, in public perception. Tensions simmered. Some nights, they boiled over. In 2005, riots erupted across dozens of French cities after the tragic deaths of two teenagers in a Paris suburb. The unrest was not just about one event, it was a release of decades of frustration over inequality, exclusion, and alienation. Fires burned in the night, and France was forced to confront a truth it had long buried, that its promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité did not always reach everyone. Meanwhile, rural France faced its own quiet crisis. Small towns lost their young people to the lure of cities. Local shops closed. Trains stopped running. Farmers, once the backbone of the nation, struggled with debt, droughts, and disconnection. Their voices, soft but steady, rose in protest too. And then there were the terror attacks, moments that shook the nation to its core. In 2015, the Charlie Hebdo shooting and the coordinated attacks across Paris brought waves of grief and fear. France wept, mourned, and stood still. Candlelit vigils glowed in town squares. The phrase "Je suis Charlie" echoed around the world. But underneath, it sparked deeper debates about freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and national unity. Out of pain, came conversation. Out of grief came resolve. In recent years, the Gilets jaunes, or yellow vests, movement swept through the country. Sparked by a fuel tax, it grew into a larger protest about economic injustice and political disconnection. Week after week, men and women in bright yellow vests gathered in towns and cities. Their demands were simple: to be seen, to be heard, to live with dignity. At the same time, France has become a stage for global conversations about climate change, women's rights, racial justice, and LGBTQ+ inclusion. Protests and parades fill the streets. Youth-led movements rise online and in real life, urging the country to be more inclusive, more sustainable, more just. Yet with each step forward, there are steps sideways or back. Far-right political parties have gained traction, raising fears of division and xenophobia. Debates over secularism and religious expression, especially concerning Muslim women who wear the hijab, reveal deep questions about what it means to be French. Still, amid the noise, there is grace. You'll find it in a grandmother teaching her grandchild how to make crepes in a sunlit kitchen. In a schoolteacher helping children from every corner of the world learn to write their first sentence in French. In a bus driver greeting each passenger with a soft bonjour. In musicians blending North African rhythms with traditional French chansons. In architects designing buildings that honor both the old and the new. France's modern struggles are not signs of failure, they are signs of growth. They show that the country is still asking hard questions, still fighting for its ideals, still evolving. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the hum of life across this diverse land. A farmer in the Dordogne finishing her day's work. A young poet scribbling verses on the metro. A student dreaming of a better future. A baker rising before dawn to knead dough in a sleepy village. These lives, full of quiet resilience, are the threads that bind France together. Though the path forward may be uncertain, one truth remains steady. The spirit of France endures, in its struggles, in its courage, and in the millions of hearts who call it home. Close your eyes now, and let your mind wander over the map of France. Not the lines and borders, but the textures, the colors, the living landscape that stretches from the cool coastlines of Normandy to the sun-drenched shores of the Côte d'Azur. France today is a country of many moods and melodies, woven together in a soft, steady rhythm. To the north, along the English Channel, lie the quiet villages of Normandy. Here, the sea mists roll in at dawn, and fishermen still rise early to cast their nets. Fields of golden wheat ripple under skies brushed with gray. The past lingers gently in these lands, at Omaha Beach, where memorials whisper of sacrifice, and in old stone farmhouses that have watched centuries pass. Travel east, and you reach the vineyards of Alsace, where the half-timbered houses lean toward narrow cobbled streets and church bells chime above rows of Riesling grapes. The region blends French and German influences in both language and architecture, a harmony that speaks of how cultures can coexist and enrich one another. Farther south, the Jura and the Alps rise like ancient guardians. In winter, snow covers the peaks in silence. In summer, green valleys cradle quiet lakes and wildflowers bloom along mountain trails. Villages like Annecy seem plucked from a storybook, wooden balconies overflowing with geraniums, their reflections shimmering in clear canals. Across the center of France, the land opens into gentle plains and forested hills. The Massif Central, a volcanic plateau, sits at the heart of it all, old, rugged, and steady. Shepherds guide their flocks through fields of thyme and lavender. Cheese is still made the traditional way, aged in caves carved from stone. And then there is the South. Ah, the South. Provence, with its purple lavender fields, its olive groves and cicadas humming in the heat. The light here is golden and warm, just as the painters said. It dances on sunflower petals, lingers on terracotta roofs, and sinks behind hills with a sleepy sigh. Further still, the Mediterranean kisses the coast. In towns like Nice and Marseille, the scent of sea salt mixes with garlic and herbs from open-air markets. Music echoes from balconies, children play in stone courtyards, and boats bob gently in marinas that have known Roman ships and pirate sails alike. In the west, Brittany juts into the Atlantic like a wild green peninsula. The tides here are bold, sweeping in and out with force and grace. Celtic legends drift through its misty forests, and cliffs stand tall over churning waves. Villagers bake buttery Cuineman pastries and speak a language older than French. And always, there is Paris. The capital still pulses with quiet magic. Under the Eiffel Tower, couples hold hands in the evening light. In Montmartre, artists sketch portraits near ivy-covered cafés. On the left bank, readers linger in bookstores while jazz drifts from an upstairs window. Paris is no longer the center of an empire, but it remains a center of spirit, style, and soul. Yet beyond the beauty, France today also wrestles gently with modern life. Cities grow, but so does the desire to preserve green spaces. Technology advances, yet village life holds firm. Young people travel the world, yet many return home to traditions that ground them. France lives in this balance, between past and present, between speed and stillness, between innovation and memory. Its people, diverse, passionate, and proud, bring richness to every region. From North African bakers in Lyon to Vietnamese restaurateurs in Bordeaux, from Breton sailors to Senegalese poets, the fabric of France is broader and more colorful than ever before. Markets still fill town squares with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Trains crisscross the countryside, connecting small places to great cities. In every department, from the snowy Savoy to the sunny Var, there is a rhythm of life that beats softly, patiently, with a sense of quiet continuity. This is France today, not just a place on a map, but a living story. A story told in the aroma of roasting chestnuts on a Paris street corner, in the hush of a cathedral at dusk, in the creak of an old bicycle by a vineyard path, in the voice of a grandmother telling bedtime stories in Corsican, or Occitan, or Arabic, in the laughter of children playing beneath a chestnut tree in some forgotten village square. The land is not just fields and rivers. It is people and memory and music and bread. It is joy and sorrow and stubborn hope. It is, still, the land of liberté, égalité, fraternité, not just as slogans, but as living ideas, imperfect and ongoing, yet ever cherished. So rest now, dear listener, and picture the land as it is tonight. Quiet farms and glowing windows, wind over hills and lights in the city, all gently breathing under the same moon. and in that quiet breath, the soul of France endures. As we close our eyes and drift towards sleep, let's look ahead, gently, calmly, toward the dreams that France holds for its tomorrow. For though France is a land of history, of ancient stones and worn paths, it is also a land of becoming. A place always asking questions, always changing, and yet always itself. Today, France stands at a crossroads, as many countries do. The world moves quickly: technology, climate, migration, economics, and France, like an old oak tree, must stretch its limbs toward the light while still holding firm to its roots. In the hearts of its people, there is a deep desire to preserve the treasures of the past while shaping a future that is just, sustainable, and vibrant. There are hopes for greener cities, where bicycles glide down leafy boulevards and gardens bloom atop apartment roofs. In Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, young architects imagine homes that breathe with the seasons, powered by the sun, cooled by nature. In the countryside, farmers speak of returning to ancient rhythms, growing food with care for the soil, the bees, the rivers. Markets bustle with local produce, and more hands reach for the wisdom of heritage seeds, traditional cheeses, and age-old methods that nourish both body and earth. There are hopes, too, for unity in diversity. France is no longer a single story, it is many stories woven together. Children born of Algerian, Senegalese, Vietnamese, Portuguese, and Caribbean heritage sing the same songs in schoolyards, learning side by side about liberty and kindness. In cities and towns, festivals celebrate cultures that once arrived as strangers and now live as neighbors. There are still challenges, yes, tensions and growing pains, but there is also resilience and a rising chorus that says, "We all belong." There is hope in the voices of artists and writers, who still look to the stars and wonder aloud. In the rhythms of musicians blending electronic beats with ancient folk tunes. In poets who scribble verses on napkins in quiet cafes. In dancers spinning barefoot across modern stages, feet rooted in tradition, arms open to the future. France dreams of being a place where every citizen, whether rural farmer or immigrant child, elderly baker or university student, feels heard, seen, and valued. There is hope for remembering the lessons of the past, not as burdens, but as lanterns. From the fires of revolution, France carries the torch of human dignity. From the rubble of war, it remembers the value of peace. From moments of darkness, it learns the power of light. And above all, there is a hope that the next chapter will be written with care. That the rivers will still flow clear through the Dordogne. That the lavender will bloom every June in Provence. That the cathedrals will stand tall in silent wonder. That laughter will echo through the vineyards. And that France will continue to be what it has always tried to be. A place where life is rich, where beauty is treasured, where the future is shaped with both reason and heart. And so, as you rest now, picture France not as it was, or even as it is, but as it might be. A land of golden fields and bustling cafes, of school children singing, of bells ringing in villages at dusk. A place where liberty grows like a wildflower, where equality is carved in stone, and where fraternity, the simple act of kindness between people, blooms like spring after a long winter. That is France's dream. And tonight, you carry a piece of it with you, gently, into your own dreams. Sleep well. And so, our journey through the story of France comes to a peaceful close. A land of echoes and elegance, of spirit and resilience. From cave paintings to cathedrals, from revolution to republic. France has endured and inspired. As you rest now, may you carry with you the quiet power of its people, the beauty of its lands, and the hope that lives in every new dawn. Thank you for joining us on this gentle journey. If you enjoyed this bedtime story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more calming history, and share it with someone who loves the magic of the past. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with starlit castles and whispering vineyards. Good night, from Sleepy Time History.